Okay.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for our webinar, Fracking Waste in New York, a Business Perspective. My name is Dana Gully, and I'm the Manager of Outreach and Volunteer Programs at Riverkeeper. Today's webinar will be presented by Laura Ornstein, Coordinator for the New York State Sustainable Business Council, and Misty Duval, Staff Attorney for Riverkeeper's Watershed Program. Just a couple of very quick housekeeping items. Everybody is on mute, but you can type questions into the question box located on the webinar pane at any point during the webinar. So on your webinar panel, there is a little box called questions. You can type your questions in there, and we will make time at the end for a Q&A. Also, we are recording this webinar, and we will send a link to you in a follow-up email this week. So if you're taking notes, please know you will have access to the recording of this webinar as well as the slideshow presentation. And we hope that you'll go ahead and share it with folks when we send it to you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Laura.
Great. Thank you, Dana. And welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. If we could, right, here's my slide. My name is Laura Ornstein. I'm the coordinator of the New York State Sustainable Business Council. I also help coordinate the national anti-fracking campaign for the American Sustainable Business Council. I am currently based in Beacon in the Hudson Valley, but have had the good fortune to live in several communities throughout New York State. The New York State Sustainable Business Council is an emerging alliance of sustainably minded business organizations and individual businesses from across the state. Our members describe themselves as socially and environmentally responsible, green, eco-friendly, B Corps, social entrepreneurs, or that they believe in the triple bottom line. Whatever language they prefer, all have a similar theme. They are values-driven and view business as a force for good rather than a profit-at-all-cost approach. Our members include Rethink Local in the Hudson Valley, Binghamton Regional Sustainability Coalition, Ecovative, JSA Financial Group, Green Star Co-op, and Renovus Energy, to name a few. We are a policy-oriented organization that works to increase the visibility of our members' stories and their way of doing business, to shift the narrative that we must choose between job creation and a clean environment or a strong economy and public health. We present the business case through interviews with press, opinion pieces, and meetings with elected officials. This year is our second active legislative session. Energy and safer chemicals have been our priority issues thus far. Last year, we organized over 1,500 businesses to call for a statewide ban on fracking, which I'm sure most, if not all of you know, was achieved in December and is now being finalized. This year, we are still pushing back on the risks and threats of fossil fuel infrastructure and byproducts, with waste from the oil and gas industry being a key priority. We also have continued to promote transitioning to 100% renewable energy by helping business leaders engage in the REV proceeding and calling for policies that will expand access to clean energy sources like shared renewables. On the chemicals front, we have a campaign called Companies for Safer Chemicals New York that I encourage all business leaders to sign on to on our website and support the Child Safe Products Act. Our partner at the national level is the American Sustainable Business Council, which has some great business case materials on fracking that I've developed with my colleague Hillary Baum. We'll be including links to materials in the follow-up email. Now I'll turn it over to Misty Duval, staff attorney at Riverkeeper, who can be credited with much of the great work you're about to hear on about fracking waste. Take it away, Misty.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thanks, Dana, for getting everything set up. And I really want to thank the New York State Sustainable Business Council for co-hosting this webinar with us today. Many of you may have heard my voice talking about fracking and fracking waste several times over the past few years. We're really excited today to have the opportunity to partner with NYSSBC to talk about this from a business perspective, which is something that I think is very unique and important and isn't raised enough in the context of this issue. So thanks to everyone again for joining us today. So as Laura said, my name is Misty Duval, and I'm a staff attorney with Riverkeeper's Watershed Program. In the Watershed Program, we work on protecting the source of drinking water for New York City and about 1 million Hudson Valley residents. Altogether, that's the drinking water supply for around 9 million New Yorkers. Prior to joining Riverkeeper, I worked in several areas of environmental law and policy here in the U.S. and abroad, including at the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, Earth Rights International, Firmer Rivers Network, and the Columbia Environmental Law Clinic. You can see details of my bio up here on the slide and my email, mduval@riverkeeper.org, which will also be on the final slide, and feel free to contact me if you have questions after the webinar. So Riverkeeper is a member-supported watchdog organization dedicated to defending the Hudson River and its tributaries and protecting the drinking water supply of 9 million New Yorkers. We have been involved in the fight against fracking in New York since 2008, and we're very excited, as I'm sure all of you were, to hear the state announce its intent to ban fracking late last year, and have continued to be active in the process of implementing that ban, which is still ongoing. We got involved in the issue of fracking waste due to our work on fracking a few years ago. We actually got involved with local activists in Westchester County trying to pass, and Westchester County eventually passed, a local ban on fracking waste, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. From there, we continued research and advocacy, and we have a website, The Facts About New York and Fracking Waste, dedicated to providing information about fracking waste and support for New York communities that are interested in passing county bans. We've also been active at the state level, past several sessions advocating for statewide legislation that would address the fracking waste issue. And I'm going to talk about all of that later on at the presentation, just to give you an introduction about who we are. And again, our website, The Facts About New York and Fracking Waste, I'll refer to it several times throughout the presentation, and we'll send a link to it afterward. So we're going to review quite a few things. We have about an hour here, and those of you who know anything about the fracking waste issue know that we could talk about this for days and still not cover everything. So what I'm going to try to do for the next 30-35 minutes is hit the high points, try and give everyone a basic understanding of what fracking is, where it comes from, why we're concerned about it, particularly in New York, some of the environmental, public health, and business risks. Then I'm going to talk about some of the action that's happening at the state level and at the local level, and we'll then wrap up with actions that you can take. As Dana said, this webinar is being recorded, and the slides will be available to you afterwards, so please don't feel like you need to rush to write down anything. There are links to further information in the slides here. We'll send out further links after the presentation, and you also will have my contact information, and Laura's as well, if you want to ask us follow-up questions. So first things first, what do we mean when we talk about fracking waste? So there are several different kinds of fracking waste. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the terms high volume fracking, high volume horizontal fracking, low volume fracking, vertical fracking, conventional drilling, unconventional drilling. There are a lot of different names and a lot of kind of different processes that we'll be talking about as we go through this presentation. For now, I want you to understand that when I'm talking about fracking, what I mean is hydraulic fracturing. And you'll see in your slide what I think is a pretty helpful kind of visualization of the process. And basically what we mean when we talk about hydraulic fracturing is a method of extracting oil and natural gas. And that method involves taking water, sand, and chemical additives, putting them down a well, using pressure to fracture that well, and then extracting the oil and natural gas from the well. And the waste that comes from that process comes in a few different forms. Again, this slide is here for your reference, just so everyone kind of knows what I'm talking about as we go through the presentation. But don't feel like you need to memorize these now. One distinction that I want everyone to be aware of as we go through the presentation is the distinction between wastewater and solid waste. And when we talk about fracking waste, we're not just talking about the waste from the actual process of putting the water and chemicals and sand down the well and then bringing that oil and gas back up. We're talking about the entire process of extracting oil and natural gas using hydraulic fracturing. So the companies go out, they will start by drilling a hole down into the ground. As that happens, there's rock, there's shale, there's other materials down into the ground that have to be brought up out of that hole. They often use drilling muds to help lubricate drill bits to make drilling a little bit easier. The soil and rock and other materials we call drill cuttings that come up from the shale, from other formations that contain oil and gas, they're going to contain whatever contaminants are actually in the formation underground. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that often includes things like BTEX chemicals, which you may have heard of, or BTEX compounds that you may have heard of, so benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, things like naturally occurring radioactive materials, salt, especially Marcellus shale has a very high salt content, other things like metals, other organic compounds. So those are all things that are currently underground and that come up in the form of drill cuttings when a drilling well is initially created. Next, you have something that we call flowback water. That just means the chemical and water and sand mixture that is put down the well, and then a lot of that will come up very soon after it goes down, and it can contain a lot of the fracking fluid that ends up going down the well. So what's important when you hear the words flowback water or flowback fluid, just know that that often contains a lot of the chemical additives that are used in fracking. And everyone has heard, you know, a lot of concerns about fracking fluid and the chemical additives that that are used that can be things like ethylene glycol or sulfuric acid, things like that. The last kind of type of fracking waste that I want to talk about quickly, because it's going to be important later when we talk about road spreading, is produced water or production brine. And basically this is the wastewater that flows to the surface along with the oil and natural gas that's extracted. So you put fracking fluid down the well, it comes back up a little bit later, it starts actually producing oil or natural gas. And along with that, you're going to get more wastewater called produced water or production brine. That's going to contain some of the flowback water that was still trapped underground, so some of the chemicals that were added during the fracking process. But importantly, it's going to contain a lot of the things that are trapped underground in the formation, in the shale already, the contaminants that we already talked about, like benzene, barium, all arsenic, naturally occurring radioactive materials. And again, these are all things that are naturally occurring, but the problem is they're naturally occurring thousands of feet below the surface. They're supposed to stay there. When we bring them up and we spread them onto the surface, then we start coming into contact with them in ways that we wouldn't be coming into contact with them if they stayed under the surface. And again, just because these are naturally occurring doesn't mean they're safe. Arsenic is naturally occurring. It doesn't mean that you would sprinkle it on your breakfast cereal, I hope. So this next slide is just a photo of fracking fluid waste from a fracking site in Pennsylvania. I actually took this picture a couple of years ago, and this is just to give you an idea of what the on-site waste storage looks like. And I was here actually right beside this location, and I was there for probably about 15 minutes, and during that time about 20 of those big waste trucks came and went. It was on this little dirt road in rural Pennsylvania, and so those trucks were coming up, they were hooking up to get waste. You can see the truck kind of closest to us as residual waste on the side. They're filling them up and they were taking off. So just to get an idea, in a high volume fracturing site, you're going to get you can get hundreds of thousands of gallons of waste being taken away from the site, because often those processes use millions of gallons of water, so you can get hundreds of thousands to millions of gallons of waste coming out of that. So now that I hope we have a basic kind of understanding about what we mean when we talk about fracking waste, I want to talk a little bit about where this waste comes from, because this is a question that we get a lot because people are understandably confused, especially now that New York has banned high-volume fracking. And when I talk about high-volume fracking, New York generally defines high-volume fracking as using more than 300,000 gallons of liquid to frack a well. Usually it's high-volume horizontal hydraulic fracturing, so it will go down to the well and then turn horizontally for up to a mile. It's a very, very intensive process. It's a newer process, and it's been the subject of a lot of controversy in New York, and it's often used to extract what we call unconventional oil and gas deposits from things like the Marcellus and Utica shales. And I know that is a huge info dump, but again, we're going to send you some follow-up information for those of you who want to read more about it. The point that I want to make here, though, is that, yes, New York has banned high-volume fracking within New York State, but we still have a problem with dealing with fracking waste and dealing with waste from oil and gas extraction. So there are two main sources that I want to talk about. The first is high-volume and low-volume fracking waste that's coming from Pennsylvania into New York State. So I'm sure many of you know, if you're familiar with fracking at all, that Pennsylvania has extensive shale gas, shale oil deposits, and fracking has been going on in Pennsylvania for a number of years. Consequently, the state of Pennsylvania produces a lot of waste, and they have to do something with that waste. Pennsylvania does dispose of some of that waste within the state, but a lot of that waste ends up being shipped out of state, places like Ohio, West Virginia, and you guessed it, New York. So New York has accepted so far more than 500,000 tons and 23,000 barrels of fracking waste from Pennsylvania. Again, this is exactly the kind of waste produced from high-volume hydraulic fracturing that New York has banned. So New York says we don't want high-volume fracking, we don't want all of the environmental and public health impacts that come with that, but we're still taking the waste from Pennsylvania. And this information, the numbers about how much waste have come to New York are based on information from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. They have an oil and gas reporting website, which is linked here if any of you want to look for further information. Now, the PA oil and gas reporting website only contains information since 2010. So these numbers are from 2010. Obviously, there was transportation going on before that. We don't know how much. These numbers are also based on voluntary reporting, so we expect them to be a little bit underreported. So I would expect that there is more waste in this that has come from Pennsylvania into New York, but these are the numbers from PA DEP. And the reason that we have to rely on these numbers from Pennsylvania is because New York doesn't keep track of this waste in a publicly accessible manner. There's no New York Department of Environmental Conservation website, there's no New York State website where you can go and you can find out how much of this waste has come into New York. So we really have to rely on the numbers from Pennsylvania. So the second type of waste source that we have to deal with is waste from conventional low-volume oil and gas extraction that's currently happening in New York and that has gone on in New York for decades. This is often what we call vertical drilling. Generally, DEC describes or defines it as, maybe tens of thousands, a lower volume of water used to extract the oil and gas. And generally, these are concentrated in the southern tier. As of 2013, there were more than 12,000 active oil and natural gas production wells in New York State. A lot of these are from formations such as the Medina Formation that have been producing oil and gas in New York State for decades. The reason that we're going to talk about this, and you'll see later in the slides, is because there are still concerns with the contaminants in waste that comes from conventional low-volume oil and gas extraction in New York. Depending on the formation, it can have very similar contaminants. You can also see things like benzene, toluene, also going to be very high concentrations of salt. You can also see naturally occurring radioactive materials, although they're going to be in a little bit lower level than in the Marcellus formation. Okay, so this is just a quick thing that I want to note before we move on in the presentation, and that is something that's called the hazardous waste loophole. What that means is that the oil and gas industry is specifically excluded from having to comply with hazardous waste requirements in New York. So the way that hazardous waste requirements work in New York for just about every other industry in the state is that if you have waste and you want to dispose of it, the first thing you need to do is you need to test it. And you need to find out if it's hazardous. And there are various tests in New York regulations that you have to go through. And basically, if your waste meets the definition of hazardous, you can't send it to a municipal solid waste landfill. You have to send it to hazardous waste landfill. You have to comply with hazardous waste treatment and storage and transportation requirements, and it's more expensive. What has happened in New York, and actually this is mirrored by a similar exclusion at the federal level and in several other states, is that waste from the oil and gas industry, so all of fracking waste, is specifically excluded from being considered as hazardous waste. So no matter what is in it, no matter if the contaminants in the waste would be classified as hazardous, they don't have to be treated like hazardous waste because of this exemption. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit later when we get to state legislation and actions that you can take, but I just wanted to highlight that here so that all of you are thinking about it as we go through this presentation. And the thing that's really concerning for businesses is that this gives an unfair advantage and a cushion for the oil and gas industry. So it allows the industry to escape the real cost of waste disposal. It puts the oil and gas industry on an uneven playing field with other industries in the state. So as I said, just about every other industry in the state, if they had this waste that was known to generally contain things like benzene, they would have to test it. And if the level of benzene was high enough, they would have to comply with hazardous waste requirements, which again are more expensive. They're more time consuming. They're more difficult to go through. You can't just take your waste, stick it in a truck, take it to the local landfill. So by having this wholesale exemption for the oil and gas industry, it really gives them an unfair advantage because non-exempt businesses end up being held, and a lot of times, to tougher rules for waste disposal when they have similar contaminants in their waste. So there are several ways of disposing of and reusing oil and gas waste or fracking waste. These include things like injecting the waste underground. These include things like storing the waste at a fracking site. These include things like reusing the waste at a different fracking site. What we're going to talk about here is we're going to focus on 3 reuse and disposable methods that are currently happening in New York that are really big concerns for us in terms of the environment and public health and impacts on businesses. And I'm going to go through these in just a minute, but I just want everyone to know that this is not a comprehensive list of all of the different ways that you can dispose of or reuse fracking waste. These are just the main 3 that we're going to talk about that we're concerned about here in New York. And the first one is landfill disposal. The second one is disposal of landfill leachate and wastewater treatment facilities. The third is the use of conventional low-volume oil and gas extraction waste on our roads. And we'll talk about each of those in turn. I just wanted to highlight them here. So this is a very good map that was put together by Karen Edelstein of Frack Tracker, and it's actually an interactive map, and there's a link to the website where this map is contained right there at the bottom. And I would encourage everyone to go to that website and kind of play with this map a little bit, because it's a very good, very well put together map. And what this shows is Pennsylvania drilling waste disposal in New York State for the past 4 years. And what you can see down in the bottom half of the screen, those are the wells where this gas or where this waste has originated in Pennsylvania. And then at the top of the screen, you see those larger circles. And those are the landfills, and then in Syracuse, a storage facility in New York that have accepted this waste. And you'll see that, for example, if you look at the purple dot over Corning and you look down to the smaller dots in Pennsylvania, you see those purple dots. Those correspond to the wells where the waste has been disposed of in Corning. And I want to note up on the top left-hand corner of the map, that is a landfill in Niagara Falls, Allied landfill that has accepted this waste in the past. It's just a little bit cut off because I am technologically deficient and could not figure out a way to get it on the screen with that entire circle there. But if you go to the website, it'll be very clear on the map. And like I said, it's interactive. You can actually play with the map a little bit. This is a list of the landfills in New York that have accepted waste from Pennsylvania since 2010. Just a list for those of you who are interested. You'll see down at the top there are, according to information from Pennsylvania DEP through 2014, landfill and Painted Post in Lowman, New York that continue to accept this waste. Again, that's current through the end of 2014 and based on self-reporting data from Pennsylvania. We're going to get the information from Pennsylvania through the first half of 2015 later this summer, and we'll see if any of those other facilities have resumed taking waste or not. The concern that we have with New York landfills accepting this waste is that this is going to municipal solid waste landfills. This is going to landfills and industrial landfills that aren't equipped to handle it. Again, because of the exemption, the hazardous waste loophole that I talked about a little bit earlier, this waste does not have to go to hazardous waste landfills. It doesn't have to be disposed of in accordance with hazardous waste requirements. It can be disposed of in accordance with more lax requirements at these solid waste and industrial landfills. The second concern that we have in New York is about fracking waste being disposed of at wastewater treatment facilities. And there are really two issues here. One is the direct disposal of fracking waste into wastewater treatment facilities, which is something that is currently not happening in New York. The New York Department of Environmental Conservation and EPA the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, have put forth pretty strict standards. And to my knowledge, no wastewater treatment facility, no publicly owned treatment works in New York State has been able to meet those standards to directly accept fracking waste. And that's because of some of the contaminants that we talked about earlier. Very high salt levels in the waste, things like metals and organic compounds, things like benzene, things like naturally occurring radioactive materials in the waste that make these wastewater treatment facilities unable to process it. There's a really interesting study from Duke University that came out a couple of years ago that looked at the practice of regular wastewater treatment facilities in Pennsylvania that had accepted fracking waste that contained things like naturally occurring radioactive materials, things like chloride and bromide in the waste. And that study found that these wastewater treatment facilities were unable to process the waste. Basically, there were increased downstream concentrations of chloride and bromide. Researchers also found sediment concentrations near the point where the facility discharged into water, where there was naturally occurring radioactive materials 200 times higher than upstream sediment concentrations. So this just means that the facilities really aren't equipped to handle and treat this waste. Recognizing that, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency has recently proposed to prohibit the discharge of fracking wastewater into oil and gas or into wastewater treatment facilities. The problem that we still have in New York, and I would imagine in other places as well, is that these prohibitions are focused on direct discharge to wastewater treatment facilities. So that means a company taking a truckload of production brine or fracking fluid right to the wastewater treatment facility. What they don't cover is landfill leachate. And landfill leachate is currently being sent to wastewater treatment facilities from landfills that accept fracking waste. So for those of you who aren't familiar, landfill leachate is basically wastewater that comes from rain and other landfill concentration processes. It filters through the waste that's in landfills, and it ends up picking up the contaminants in that waste. So if you have waste in a landfill that contains things like benzene or high salt levels or naturally occurring radioactive materials, that ends up collecting in the landfill leachate, and then that leachate is sent to a nearby wastewater treatment facility for processing. And so we think if, it's very well documented that regular wastewater treatment facilities, publicly owned treatment work, cannot treat produced fluid, cannot treat fracking fluid. So why are we sending them leachate from landfills that accept fracking waste that has the same kind of contaminants? So that's something that we're very focused on and is a major concern for us in New York State. The last reuse and disposal method that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I think I'm a little bit behind on time, is the use of production brine for road spreading in New York State. Now again, this is brine from conventional low-volume fracking in New York State and brine from natural gas storage operations in New York State. It's used on the roads for de-icing, dust control, and road stabilization purposes. Riverkeeper has quite a bit of information about these approvals from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. Those are all listed on our website, which we'll send around after the call. The takeaway is that according to our information, from 2011 to 2014, the use of this waste on roads in New York was approved in portions of at least 41 municipalities in several western New York counties, which you can see listed here on your slides. The New York State Department of Transportation also received permission to spread this waste on state roads in 10 western New York counties. Our concern is that when this waste is spread on roads, a lot of times it doesn't stay there, right? If it's spread on roads for de-icing purposes, you end up having a lot of slush. If there's rainfall afterward, when the snow melts, where does that waste go? It runs off into the roads. So it can contaminate adjoining properties. It can end up going into receiving waters downstream. It could potentially contaminate water sources, potentially groundwater sources if there's a close to surface connection. And we received results from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation that showed the presence of very high salt levels in the natural gas production brine and the natural gas storage brine, and also the presence of benzene and toluene in some of the oil production brine and natural gas storage brine that was approved for use on our roads. And again, all of this information is on our website. So here is a list of some of the common contaminants of fracking waste. I've already talked about these, so I'm going to skip past this slide, but you'll see there are links for further information, government and nonprofit sources where you can read more if you'd like. So what I want to talk about for the next few minutes is some of the impacts that we can see and that we're concerned about for New York businesses. So some of the common contaminants that we've talked about, a lot of them have potential impacts on public health. So for example, you can see benzene is a carcinogen, naturally occurring radioactive material is a carcinogen, toluene linked to nervous system, kidney, liver problems, barium can cause sickness as well. So can a lot of the other contaminants that are commonly found in fracking waste. This is just kind of an example. And what we're concerned about for businesses is that, when people are sick, when they're worried about sick family members, they're going to miss work. They're not going to work as well. And that's going to end up costing businesses money. Businesses are going to end up being less productive. There are also concerns with overall impacts on the business climate in New York. So some of the prominent economic drivers in New York are agriculture, food production, beverage production, tourism. All of these things depend on clean water, clean air, and clean soil. So if you have something like disposal of fracking waste in a facility unable to properly treat it, or the spreading of fracking waste on our roads, if that ends up contaminating soil or water, then you can end up damaging businesses in New York that rely on clean air, clean soil, clean water. There have been reports of livestock illnesses and deaths due to exposure from fracking fluid. And a really important point that I want to make is that just the mere presence of waste disposal near food and beverage producers can threaten consumer confidence. So even if you don't have a verified instance of contamination, just the risk of contamination, just people knowing that you have this waste nearby can really undermine confidence. And so consumers can start questioning whether or not a product is safe, and that can cause damage to food and beverage producers, to businesses that rely on them. So a few recent examples are some consumers avoid food from certain parts of Pennsylvania where fracking is common. A lot of you may have seen recent news reports about the use of fracking oil wastewater for irrigation in California, and I don't know about you, but that makes me a little bit worried about my food coming from California. There have also been, a farm closed due to concerns about chemicals and fracking waste nearby. So this is something that is already having impacts on businesses and could very easily become a major concern for businesses in New York. So for the last 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about what is happening in New York to address the concerns about fracking waste and what you can do to help address those concerns. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about legislation at the state level and then legislation at the local level. So we talked earlier about the hazardous waste loophole, basically that fracking waste from the oil and gas industry is excluded from being considered as hazardous waste, excluded from hazardous waste requirements. So this bill, you can see the bill number up there. It's sponsored by Senators Avella and Senator Avella, Assemblyman Engelbright. It would close that loophole. So basically, it would say that waste from the oil and gas industry needs to be subject to the exact same standards as waste from just about every other industry in New York State. It has to be tested. If it's hazardous, it has to be treated accordingly. All we want to do is end the exemption, put everybody on the same playing field. And this bill has moved in the Assembly. So what this means is that the bill started in the Environmental Conservation Committee in the Assembly. It's been voted out of the committee. It has gone to the full Assembly, but it hasn't yet been scheduled for a vote. So what we're doing is asking Assembly members to vote on the hazardous waste loophole bill and pass it. It has passed the Assembly in the past. I expect that it would easily pass the Assembly again. In the Senate, this bill is currently stuck in the Environmental Conservation Committee. It has 32 co-sponsors, which is enough to pass it if it came up for a vote. It has bipartisan Republican and Democratic support. So what we're asking is for the hazardous waste loophole bill to be moved out of committee, to be scheduled for a vote in the Senate, and we're asking for senators to vote yes to pass the hazardous waste loophole bill. So the New York legislative session ends next week. Right now, session is scheduled to end next Wednesday, June 17th. So this is something that we're really pushing hard for, and we think the hazardous waste loophole bill can be passed and should be passed by the end of this session. There are two other bills, actually there are several other bills that address this issue at the state level, but there are two that I want to mention here briefly. One is the disposal ban bill that's being sponsored by Senator Hoylman and Assemblyman Buchwald. It currently has support, is in the Environmental Conservation Committee in both the Senate and Assembly. It would ban the acceptance of fracking waste at landfills and in wastewater treatment facilities, including leachate and wastewater treatment facilities. A companion bill is the road spreading ban bill that's being sponsored by Senator Hoylman and Assemblyman Avenatti, again, in the Environmental Conservation Committee in both the Senate and Assembly, and it would ban the use of oil and gas waste on New York roads for road spreading. These are both very important bills, and we think are the clearest and easiest way to make sure that New York landfills, New York wastewater treatment facilities stop accepting fracking waste, and fracking waste stops going on our roads. These two bills have unfortunately not garnered as much support as the hazardous waste loophole bill this session, but they will stay and they'll be renewed again next session. So we're hoping this is something that we can see move next session as a complement and a next step beyond the hazardous waste loophole bill. So local legislation, many of you may be aware that several counties and municipalities in New York State have gotten tired of waiting for the state to take action and have taken action on their own. So far, at least 15 counties in New York have banned the improper disposal and reuse of fracking waste. So there are 4 counties in the state, Tompkins, Albany, Clinton, Cayuga, that have banned all 3 methods we talked about: landfills, wastewater treatment facilities, and road spreading. All of these other counties have banned various combinations, but the important point is that all of these counties have taken action. And we have seen an increasing number of counties take action. A lot of these bans happen in the past few years, and we hope to see more in the future. New York City has introduced a ban that would cover all 5 counties of New York City that's being sponsored by Councilman Levin and Johnson. It's currently in the Environmental Committee and the New York City Council, but we hope to see that move very soon, and we hope to see a ban in New York City. Riverkeeper has developed model legislation that can be used at the county and local level to help pass a ban. That legislation is on our website, and again, we'll be sending that link around after the presentation. So now we get to the most exciting part of the presentation, which is what can you do? And I'm going to talk about several of the actions that we have, other actions that you can take for the next week of the legislative session, and then work that you can do at the local level if your community does not already have a ban. And again, you can contact me with questions afterward. We're going to be sending links to everything that's on this page, so don't worry about trying to write it down. So the first thing is, like I said, we are working really hard to try and support passage of the hazardous waste loophole bill during the next week. So Riverkeeper has an action alert. We're asking people to contact their state representatives to ask them to vote to pass the hazardous waste loophole bill immediately. And we'll send around a link to our action alert. All you do is you go in, you put in your address, and our system will figure out your assembly representative and your Senate representative, and then there's an email that you can use to send them a message basically telling them why this is a concern and asking them to vote yes for the bill. And you can add, anything you'd like to that. We're also trying to increase press and social media support for the bill. Riverkeeper, I wrote a blog post last week that talks about fracking waste, why we're concerned about it, why we need to close the hazardous waste loophole, and talks about examples from counties that have taken action and encouraging the state to take action as soon as possible. We'll send a link to that blog around. I would encourage anyone to take information from that blog, from our website, from the materials in this presentation, write an op-ed in your local newspaper in support of the hazardous waste loophole bill. What you want to do is ask your assemblyman, ask your senator to vote to pass the hazardous waste loophole bill as soon as possible. We need leadership to bring the vote up, to schedule for a vote. We need all the senators and assembly people to vote in favor of the bill. Laura has amazingly offered to help draft and submit op-eds for any of you who are interested, so please contact her if you are. The last thing that we're doing for the hazardous waste loophole bill is called Fracking Waste Wednesdays. So the next one is this week, obviously Wednesday, June 10th. The last one will be Wednesday, June 17th next week, the last day of session, unless the Senate and Assembly do us a huge favor and decide to pass the loophole bill this week, which will be very exciting, but we'll see. And what we're asking people to do is use social media to express your support for closing the hazardous waste loophole bill, and use the hashtag #NoFrackWaste, which is here. What you can do is you can go to Riverkeepers, you can go to NYSSBC's Facebook and Twitter pages, and you can just share our information on Facebook with the hashtag #NoFrackWaste. You can retweet our tweets with the hashtag #NoFrackWaste. We encourage you to tweet, send messages to Senate leaders Flanagan and Klein, to Assembly Leader Hasty, asking them to vote yes to pass the hazardous waste loophole bill as soon as possible, hashtag #NoFrackWaste. Again, we'll send out links to Riverkeeper and NYSSBC social media sites afterward. Like I said, feel free to use any of our language. Feel free to use your own language. The most important thing is that we are visible with the hashtag #NoFrackWaste on Wednesday, so that we can show our representatives how important this issue is to us and how they need to take action immediately. As I said, the state legislative session is ending soon, ending this month, right now scheduled to end next week. So we're going to also ask people to keep an eye on the two ban bills that would ban fracking waste disposal, fracking waste road spreading. Those are going to come up again next session. We encourage you to talk with your local state representative during the off session, during the summer, during the fall, mention these bills, mention how important it is to you to see state level action on fracking waste, and then we'll try to address those again during the next legislative session. The last thing that I want to talk about is supporting passage of a local ban in your community. So in the previous slide, I have a list of all the local bans. If your county is not on that list, I would really encourage you to reach out. Reach out to your county legislative representative, reach out to the county legislature. We have a lot of information on our website. We have a model ban on our website. We have example county bans on our website. Something that's been very helpful that we've seen is that when there are bans in an area, for example, Westchester County ban, then neighboring counties look at that and they say, oh, maybe this is something we should be concerned about. So right after the Westchester County ban, there was a ban in neighboring Putnam County, things like that. And if you have questions, I'd be very happy to answer your questions. I'd be happy to support as I can. We're not able, I'm one person, we're not able to go to every community in the state, unfortunately, but I am very happy to answer any questions and take requests for support and really support as we're able in any way that we can. And again, we're going to send a link to our website with all of this information following the presentation. And if you want to click on this slide right here, Riverkeeper model bans, it'll take you right there. So with that, I think we still have a little bit of time left for questions. Here's contact information again for me and Laura, and I will open it up to questions.
Thanks, Misty. That was really great. So yes, this is an opportunity for you to type your questions into the question box on the webinar panel, and then we will receive those and be able to answer them. We don't have any questions yet, but we'll give everybody a minute to formulate your questions and send those along to us. Okay, still no questions. Oh, okay. Hang on just a moment. Questions are starting to come in.
Okay, so the first question is whether there's a map showing where the waste is being spread. That's a great question, and the answer is yes. So the same organization, Frack Tracker, that created that really great interactive map that I showed earlier about which landfills are taking this waste, they also created an interactive map showing where the waste has been spread. And unfortunately, I am not technologically savvy enough to get that map to work on these slides. I tried and I gave up. So we will send a link to that map after the presentation. Okay, so the second question that I've gotten is how can business owners support these important advocacy initiatives? And I'll start answering, and then Laura, maybe if you have something to add after I finish. So what we encourage business owners to do is, one, get active in your local community. So right now, during the next week, we would very much encourage you to write an op-ed in support of the Hazardous Waste Loophole bill. You can use information from our blog post. Laura is available and has offered to help draft and submit information. We would also really love to hear from business owners about their support of these initiatives. So specifically about their support of the Hazardous Waste Loophole bill. If you can tweet your senator, tweet your assembly person this Wednesday and next Wednesday, tell them that you want them to pass the Hazardous Waste Loophole bill, tell them that it's important for business. That would be very extremely helpful. And then the last thing is get involved in your local community. If your community doesn't have a ban, contact your county legislature, tell them how important it is to you and your businesses, and again, I'd be happy to support with that. Laura, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks, Misty. All great options. What I'd want to add is, calling your legislators, whether it's your assembly person or your senator, to call them, tell them, the business that you're representing, talk about whether it's how many employees you have or whatever maybe you want to mention relating to your economic impact in the community. It would be a great thing to mention and talk about your support. Also add, talk to other business people any colleagues, talk to your customers. This is something we're noticing. I think not a lot of people are aware of this issue. They think that now that we've enacted a fracking ban that we're out of the woods. So the more that you can do to talk about this, to make sure people are aware that this is happening, but also to make sure that those messages are making it to your elected officials. So even after the legislative session ends next week on the 17th, if any of you are interested in setting an in-district meeting where you can meet with your state senator or state assembly person closer to home without having to make the trip to Albany, I'm happy to help coordinate that and facilitate. So if you have any questions about specifics on what you can do, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to walk you through it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Laura. So we have a question about whether the disposal ban bill S340 would apply to New Jersey, or is it just for New York citizens? And so I've gone back. You can see the slide here about the state and local legislation. And so this is New York only. So this bill and all of the bills listed here at the state level are in the New York Senate and the New York Assembly. So they would just cover New York State.
And this is Laura again. One other thing I wanted to add to that, even, it's great to see how the counties have gone ahead and passed prohibitions, but a statewide solution is really key here. We need to have a statewide legislation passed, because even at the county level, they don't apply to state roads. So the state is the one that does need to act here to make sure that all of the roads in all of New York all of its businesses and residents are protected.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Dana, how much time do we have left for questions?
We're just wrapping up here. We have another 2 or 3 minutes, and there's a couple more questions coming in.
Okay, great. There's one here that's asking, so what is being done to let people know about the use of fracking waste on our roadways? That's a great question. So as I mentioned, Riverkeeper has a website. We'll send a link to that a little bit later on and after we're finished. That has a summary of all of the information that we received from New York DEC as well as all of the testing results. That's something that we've shared widely on social media, in the media. When that website was released about 1.5 years ago, it got extensive media coverage throughout the state, and that's something that we have continued to promote as much as we can. And I often go and give, talks like this, talks in communities, and try and spread this information as much as we can. And we definitely encourage, other ideas that people have or other ways that people would be interested or able to spread this information. Because you're right, it's very important.
Right, and Misty, this is Laura. And am I right in saying that the government themselves have not done much to put this information out there or track this? As you mentioned, New York State doesn't even have a publicly accessible database, so it's really been, the good work of the advocates like Riverkeeper and us that have done everything we can and continue to get this out there.
That's exactly right. This information about where road spreading has been approved is not publicly available at all. Riverkeeper had to submit a Freedom of Information Law request to actually get it from DEC. So it's, if anyone's ever done that can be a little bit of a long process. And definitely we have not seen the state making this information readily available. Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one last question. There's one here about the hazardous waste loophole and whether it's a federal exemption and how New York has adopted it. So you're very right that the hazardous waste loophole is a federal exemption. It started as an exemption in federal law, but New York legally has the ability on several different issues, including this one, to be more stringent than federal law. So just because there's a federal exemption, that does not mean that New York has to have an exemption. And New York actually took separate action to adopt the hazardous waste loophole exemption. That exemption is in New York state regulations. This is actually on this slide right in front of you. This is the exemption and the citation to New York regulations.
All right. So it is 2 o'clock. I think we're going to wrap up there. But again, I would say if people have any other questions, feel free to send them to Misty or myself. I don't know if Misty, maybe if you want to put the contact information slide up again, just so people have our email addresses.
And again, you can expect to receive a follow-up email from us with lots of the links that were included in the presentation to those resources. And you can expect to receive that from us, as well as the recording of this webinar. And we ask that you please share it with your networks as well.
Okay, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.